Before the last ice age, a range of mountains blocked the north and eastern approaches to Manchester's site. During the ice age, glaciers ground them down to a height of between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. When the ice caps melted, glacial streams known to us now as the rivers Irk, Irwell and Medlock carved deep clefts and valleys across the landscape. It was these natural lines of communication that brought the first settlers to the region, and by 2,000 years ago it's thought that a small Celtic colony called Mancunian, the place of tents, had developed on a sandstone bluff near to the confluence of the Medlock and Irwell. Under the Romans, who conquered Britain in 43 AD, the place of tents took on a new significance as the junction of a network of highways linking the important Roman towns of Chester, York, Buxton and Lancaster. In 79 AD, to protect military and commercial traffic on the roads from attack by the local Brigantes tribe, the Romans built a fort here. They called it either Mamucium, meaning breast-shaped hill, or, according to some sources, Mancunium, their version of the Celtic name. The original frontier fort of turf and wood was soon replaced with a stone version, parts of which have been reconstructed as it would have looked in about 200 AD. As Roman Britain prospered and activity on its roads increased, particularly with valuable consignments of salt from Cheshire, Mancunium became a busy resting place for travellers and a civilian settlement of traders, craftsmen and soldiers' families developed outside the fort. And what a cosmopolitan place it must have been. As well as foreign traders and the native British who were rapidly becoming Romanised, the various legions garrisoned here came from all over the Roman Empire, bringing their customs and beliefs with them. Among the new religions to arrive in this way was Christianity. Britain was more tolerant of the new faith than elsewhere, and an early Christian community developed in Mancunium. A fragment of pottery carrying a Christian symbol dating from about 170 AD, 140 years before Rome adopted the faith, was found here. The earliest known Christian relic discovered in Britain. At its height, Mancunium was a thriving cultural melting pot with a population of around 2,000 people. By the 5th century, Rome found itself under threat from barbarian tribes, and in 411 its soldiers were recalled to defend the homeland, leaving Mancunium vulnerable to attack from warlike northern tribes. In 429 it was plundered by Picts and Scots, although the major threat came not from hostile neighbours but from farther afield, and soon a new breed of invader burst onto this island shores. Pagan tribes from northern Germany swept all resistance before them. By the mid-6th century, most of what became Angleland was under Anglo-Saxon control, and they began tilling the land they had soaked with British blood. A new settlement was established near the confluence of the Irk and Irwell, which the newcomers gave their own name, Mancester. Cester meaning castle, remembering the Roman site, which it seems was now abandoned. It fell into ruin and was known as the Castle in the Field. Other Anglo-Saxon settlements in the area were Salford, that grew at a natural crossing of the River Irwell, and Stretford, or Street Ford, where a Roman road crossed the Mersey into Trafford. By the late 8th century, most of Saxon England had embraced Christianity, and a church dedicated to St Mary was built on the site of the present cathedral. In the 9th century, a new threat to England loomed as Viking raiding parties began sacking wealthy monasteries. Raids became more daring and frequent until, in 865, a huge army of Norwegians and Danes landed in East Anglia. Nowhere was safe from these fearsome people, and in 870 terror spread in Manchester at the news that the Norsemen were heading this way. Their versatile longboats had brought them up the Mersey to just beyond Warrington, and they were now making their bloody way overland, plundering towns and villages in their path and slaughtering anyone who stood in their way. Manchester was pillaged and its people put to the sword. The Vikings settled a huge area of northern England. Norwegians in the west, Danes in the east, and once again Manchester found its culture and language subject to foreign influence. An English revival started by Alfred the Great of Wessex led to Manchester being recaptured in 923, when according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, King Edward the Elder sent troops to repair and garrison it. By now, Viking settlement was a fait accompli, and King Edward, as he had done elsewhere, manned his new fortifications with a mixture of Englishmen and Scandinavians. Part of the new defences are thought to have been a ditch, or in Old English, hangan, 30 feet deep and up to 20 feet across, that followed the line of and gave its name to Hanging Ditch. By the middle of the 10th century, for the first time, England was united under the House of Wessex, but conflict continued, and in 1016 England's crown passed to King Canute of Denmark. Canute is said to have granted Manchester the right to mint coins and also taken revenue from a mill known as Canute's Mill, later corrupted to Knott Mill. Other relics of Viking influence exist in modern Manchester. Gate comes from gata, Scandinavian for street. 2 centuries of struggle for the throne between English and Dane were finally ended by a Norman, and on Christmas Day 1066 William, Duke of Normandy, was crowned William I of England. In 1069 the new king came north to quell one of the last serious English rebellions and almost certainly passed through Manchester on his way from York to Chester. The old Roman roads were still the main highways. As was the case all over England, the land was divided up between William's loyal followers. Manchester was part of the administrative area known as the Salford Hundred, Salford being far more important than the little settlement across the river, and came into the hands of Roger of Poitou, a French knight who had fought alongside William the Conqueror at Hastings. The Domesday Book shows that Manchester's population was less than 3,000, only a little more than in Roman times. It had a priest and a piece of ploughland set aside free of taxes for use by St Mary's Church. Remarkably, a small piece of that land has escaped development, its name recalling its former use. In 1102, Henry I created the Barony of Manchester, which excluded Salford, the first step in a process that would see Manchester eventually overshadow its neighbour. In the early 13th century, Robert Grelly, 5th Baron of Manchester, built a manor house near to St Mary's Church, overlooking the Irwell. And with the lord of the manor now in residence, the town began to expand. In 1222, he was granted the right to hold a weekly market in Akersfield. Traders had to approach along Deansgate and turn into a narrow alley, known as Toll Lane, where the Baron's men collected tolls on all goods to be sold. By 1282, the developing town had a common oven in Mealgate, now Long Millgate, where townsfolk paid a fee to the Baron to bake their bread, and 2 mills on the Irk, one for grinding corn and one for cleaning and thickening wool, or fulling, one of the first references to a trade that would dominate Manchester for the next 6 centuries. By 1301 the town's trade had grown to such a level that a set of rules were laid down to regulate it. The Great Charter of Manchester also established the Court Leet, an elected body with the responsibility for governing the town. Early town records show that a stone bridge across the Hangan, known as Hanging Bridge, was a main thoroughfare into Manchester, and today provides a tantalising glimpse of the handiwork of early medieval Mancunians. In 1422, priest John de la Warr acquired Manchester through marriage and founded a college of clergy in the manor house. St Mary's gained in importance with this development, and extensive rebuilding reflected its new standing as a collegiate church. Other developments were the appearance of new houses in the orchards on the eastern side of Long Millgate, and new buildings in Marketstead Lane, now Market Street, that had previously contained only a few barns. The old stalls or shambles of the marketplace were replaced with permanent shops. As well as new buildings, existing ones were enlarged. It was common in medieval times for the elderly to relinquish part of their estate in return for board and lodging. Houses were extended to accommodate them, and the Old Wellington, one of Manchester's few surviving medieval buildings, started out as a single shop and house. In 1538, Henry VIII's historian, John Leyland, came this way and left a rather quaint description of the town. I passed over Cornbrook, and after that I came within a mile of Manchester, by Mr Trafford's park and place. Manchester on the south side of the Irwell standeth in Salfordshire, and is the fairest, best built, and most populous town in all Lancashire. There be divers stone bridges in the town, but the best of 3 arches is over Irwell. This bridge divideth Manchester from Salford. Meanwhile, the cloth trade continued to flourish, boosted by the arrival of a large number of highly skilled Flemish weavers fleeing persecution in Europe. Manchester became a finishing centre for woolen cloth produced on the Pennines, and the coarse linen and sacks made from locally grown flax. The cloth trade had grown very much as a cottage industry, with whole families involved in manufacturing the products that found their way to worldwide markets. In order to guarantee the quality of those products, in 1566 an official measurer or ell-bearer was appointed to Manchester to measure and mark every length of cloth. The ell-bearer had deputies in the other main Lancashire cloth-producing towns, where dealers bought up the produce of individual weavers and sent it off to agents in London's cloth market, where there was a Manchester Hall especially for Lancashire-made goods. One Manchester man, Nicholas Mosley, was a highly successful exporter and eventually became Lord Mayor of London, a baronet, and by 1596 wealthy enough to buy the lordship of his home town, beginning Manchester's long association with the Mosley family. With a merchant now ruling the roost, Manchester was set to capitalise on every opportunity going, but first it had the little matter of a civil war to contend with. In 1642, friction between King Charles I and Parliament came to a head, and on August the 22nd, the King raised his standard in Nottingham. By September, Manchester was in turmoil. Led by the Puritan church warden, Richard Hayrick, and William Bourne, a fellow of its college, Manchester had rebelled against the King and refused entry to his soldiers, led by Lord Strange of Liverpool. Hayrick and Bourne then rallied local parliamentarians against strong local royalist opposition and employed a German mercenary, Lieutenant Colonel John Rosworm, to organise the town's defences. Most of Manchester's 5,000 or so inhabitants were crowded around the church, Deansgate and Market Street, where Rosworm erected barricades of mud reinforced with chains. On September the 24th, a report reached Manchester that the persistent Lord Strange was heading this way with an army of 4,000 men, including 2,000 foot, 300 horse and 6 heavy guns. The town's defenders were no more than 1,000. The next morning, worshippers at St Mary's were alarmed at the church bells being rung backwards and rushed out to find the Royalists had reached Salford, which supported the king. Strange crossed the bridge but was refused entry and set up his headquarters at the home of Sir Edward Mosley. His cannons bombarded the parliamentarians at the other end of Deansgate mercilessly until Monday morning, when, convinced the Roundheads would have been sufficiently weakened, he sent in his cavalry. Lookouts on the church tower were able to give advanced warning of the Royalist movements, and attacks on the area around Shude Hill and Market Street were repulsed. Attention turned to Deansgate and Salford Bridge. Rosworm held the bridge, but Captain Bradshaw was particularly hard-pressed in Deansgate. The Cavaliers almost broke through when 20 musketeers sent by Rosworm arrived in the nick of time and turned them back. When Lord Strange changed his conditions for surrender from £1,000 to the sacrifice of 200 muskets, then again to only 50, the reply left little to the imagination. "Not so much as a rusty dagger," cried the dogged Mancunians. After a week of almost constant bombardment, Manchester had still not fallen, although its defenders were now exhausted. A dense pall of smoke hung over the town. Many of its buildings were reduced to smouldering ashes. Its defences were crumbling, and ammunition was low. It was surely only a matter of time before Manchester was taken. A burst of activity in the Royalist ranks, and the cry went up that another attack was imminent, bringing the weary Roundheads back to their positions. As they braced themselves for the umpteenth time, they realised the activity wasn't the prelude to another attack. The Cavaliers were withdrawing. Astonishment turned to cheers as Lord Strange led his army back to Liverpool. Although the casualties were relatively light, the importance of the battle was enormous. Had Manchester fallen, the Royalists would have had complete control over Lancashire, and the final outcome of the Civil War may have been different. As it was, the town became the parliamentary headquarters and centre of the Committee for Lancashire. The first stage of the Civil War ended in 1649 with the execution of Charles I, and Manchester got back to doing what it did best, quickly reinforcing its position as Britain's leading cloth manufacturer. One of the many buildings damaged in the Civil War siege was the old Priest's College, and in 1653 it was bought and restored with money left in the will of Humphrey Chetham, a prominent local figure and textile merchant. The main building became Chetham's Hospital School, and the priest dormitories Chetham's Library. This is the oldest free public library still in existence. In spite of its great success on the world cloth market and the burgeoning wealth of some of its merchants, Manchester's population was still little more than 5,000. St Mary's stood at the heart of the town, and three main streets, Deansgate, Long Millgate and Marketstead Lane, stretched out into surrounding meadows. Piccadilly Gardens were then still fields. Cows grazed on the banks of the Irwell, and people drew their drinking water from a fresh spring, now buried beneath spring gardens. The town's merchants, always willing to adapt to new methods or adopt new materials, had embraced the exotic fibre known as cotton, and Manchester began to reflect the profits to be made. The first major physical change financed by cotton was the creation of St Anne's Church on part of the old marketplace in Akersfield that became St Anne's Square. Toll Lane was widened and known as St Anne Street. Money was also invested in improving communications. In 1724, Manchester's first turnpike road was opened to Buxton, and at around the same time the Irwell and Mersey were dredged, making navigation to Liverpool possible. In 1729, the cotton trade acquired a new headquarters when Sir Oswald Mosley built the Cotton Exchange in the old marketplace. In November 1745, 300 young Mancunians lined up in St Anne's Square, a shilling each better off, the down payment for joining the rebel army of Bonnie Prince Charlie. On the 1st of December, the young men followed the Prince and the rest of his 5,000 strong force out of Manchester, crossed the Mersey at Stockport and eventually reached the Trent near Derby. His intention had been to march on London, but the lack of support en route and the prospect of facing 30,000 government troops rather weakened his resolve. On December the 9th, the young Pretender passed through Manchester again, this time on his way home. What remained of his army was pelted with stones and turf, and in the bloody revenge that followed the uprising, the heads of 3 Jacobite supporters were sent back to Manchester and displayed on the roof of Oswald Mosley's Cotton Exchange. The Bonnie Prince had certainly had his 3 shillings worth. With the Jacobite Rebellion crushed, a period of political stability was possible. Manchester found itself perfectly placed to cash in on the business opportunities that would become available, and was about to embark on one of the most remarkable periods in its history. Despite the huge improvement of many of England's roads brought about by turnpiking, mid-18th century travel was still a slow and expensive business. The flying coach to London from Manchester took 4 days, but by now a new transport revolution was in the offing. When the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal opened in 1761, the Manchester Mercury reported, "It will be of very great use as well as ornament," and it certainly was. The price of coal from the Duke's pits at Worsley dropped from 7p a hundredweight to 4p, and with consumption at around 10,000 tonnes a year and rising, the savings were huge. The Duke made a fortune, and canal mania gripped the nation. As the canal network grew, the cost of transporting raw materials in and finished goods out of Manchester provided a huge boost to the town's trade. When the Bridgewater Canal was extended to the Mersey, it undercut the Mersey-Irwell Company, cutting the price of raw cotton from Liverpool, and also produced one of the marvels of the canal age, James Brindley's aqueduct that carries the canal over the River Irwell at Barton. Innovations in other fields, though, were to have an even greater impact on Manchester. In 1767, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny that was able to spin several threads at once. The jenny was followed 2 years later by Arkwright's water frame, and in 1779 Samuel Compton combined the best of both to come up with the mule, a spinning machine that could do the work of several weavers. Richard Arkwright had successfully put his water frame to work in a purpose-built mill at Cromford, and in 1780 built a 5-storey mill on this site at Shude Hill, Manchester's first factory. The implications of these developments were understood by all sectors of the textile industry, although the reactions to them were quite different. Weavers, concerned at the loss of their traditional independence, banded together to destroy machinery in a vain attempt to halt the march of progress, while manufacturers embraced the new technology with open arms, the lure of the pound far greater than any concern over Luddite action. Factories sprang up wherever there was a suitable site, driven by the rivers Irwell, Irk and Medlock. The final piece of the industrial jigsaw was provided by James Watt when he perfected his rotative action steam engine that could increase a mill's production by up to 300%. In no time at all, Manchester's mills were all steam powered, hammering away, day and night, belching out clouds of black smoke, coating the town with a layer of soot, and making their owners undreamed of fortunes. As the machines grew bigger, so did the mills, and huge structures grew up along the canals. One, at Ancoats, built by the Scottish brothers George and Adam Murray, was 8 stories high and employed over 1,000 workers. Such was the marvel of Manchester's immense factories, they even became a tourist attraction. There was, though, a dark side to this unchecked drive towards industrialisation that cast a long shadow over its unparalleled success. When Richard Arkwright had perfected his machines that turned bales of raw cotton into bundles of yarn, he found that children could keep them running, and that nimble young fingers were ideal for joining the broken threads. When Lancashire magistrates opposed night work for children, large employers went to the poorhouses of London and Birmingham to recruit their young workers. In many cases, with the blessing of the authorities there, glad to be rid of the burden. One authority that did check up on the well-being of their charges revealed the conditions young children were often kept in. They work from 5 in the morning until 8 o'clock in the evening, are poorly fed and sleep 3 to a bed, with 1 blanket and 1 dirty sheet. They have only 1 ragged suit of clothes and no shoes or stockings. In hard economic terms, though, this combination of high productivity and slave labour was highly successful. By 1801, exports had risen from £46,000 to £5.5 million, and once again Manchester began to reflect its new wealth with a number of extravagant building projects. The first of many was the Portico Library, built in 1806 on Mosley Street, followed in 1809 by a new, much larger exchange building that provided a focal point for the town's business dealings, with as many as 7,000 dealers in the cotton or other trades able to assemble here. For Manchester's growing and increasingly impoverished working class, life was nowhere near as grand. The combined population of Salford and Manchester in 1752 had stood at 18,000. By 1801, Manchester's alone was more than 70,000 and still increasing rapidly. The once proud, well-paid and independent weavers and spinners found themselves competing for unskilled jobs with a vast pool of newcomers. The competition forced wages down, and by 1819 they were actually half what they had been 13 years earlier. To make matters worse, in 1815 the government had introduced a tax on corn, forcing up the price of bread, the staple food of the poor. Inevitably, discontent among the working classes developed, and a strong nationwide movement for political reform gathered pace. Food riots had already taken place here in 1797 and again in 1812, which in the days before organised police forces had led to the formation of the Manchester and Salford Yeoman Cavalry from among the town's manufacturers and traders. On August the 16th, 1819, a reform meeting was held in Petersfield in Manchester. 60,000 people in all, answering orator Henry Hunt's call to come, armed only with clear consciences. The protesters entered the field in dignified groups, men, women and children in their Sunday best, carrying banners and accompanied by numerous brass bands. The nervous magistrate, William Holton, watched from Mount Street, with troops, including the amateur yeomanry, stationed around the town in case of trouble. As Henry Hunt climbed onto the platform to address the largest meeting ever held in England, he was greeted by a huge roar of support, which so unnerved the magistrate that in a panic he ordered Hunt's arrest. Being the nearest, the amateurs of the Manchester and Salford Yeoman Cavalry were sent from Portland Street to carry out the arrest. Anne Files just happened to be passing with her 2-year-old son, who was flung from her arms by a cavalryman hurrying to the scene. The boy was killed, a tragic portent of what was to come. When they reached Petersfield, the yeomanry were jostled and attacked by militants from Stockport, which fueled their already bitter hatred of radicalism. They charged, sabres drawn at the militants, and beyond them to the women and children in their Sunday best. Now the regular army arrived, and 60,000 people fled the charge of the 15th Hussars like frightened rabbits, only to be hemmed in by the advancing troops of the 31st and 88th Foot, the Cheshire Yeoman Cavalry, and the 6-pounder guns of the Royal Horse Artillery. The Manchester Yeomanry continued their frenzied attacks on the panic-stricken crowd, often cutting down people they knew, and who knew them. Young and old, women with babies, men with children on their shoulders, none was safe from their slashing sabres. An old woman cried out to a man she had nursed as a child, "Nay, Tom Shelmerdine, thee will not hurt me, I know." He rode her down. At the end of the day, 11 people lay dead and 400 injured in a scene resembling a battlefield. The term Peterloo was coined. Waterloo had been fought 4 years earlier. News of the massacre not only shocked the nation, but also focused attention on the reform struggle. In 1832, the Reform Act finally broke the stranglehold the landed gentry had on politics, giving more people the right to vote, and Manchester its first 2 MPs. Manchester had begun to emerge from the pioneering days that had turned it into something resembling a Klondike frontier town, and facilities needed to sustain a growing business and working community evolved. Banks, shops, legal firms, theatres, pubs and brothels all thrived. And in 1821 the Manchester Guardian had been founded to keep the growing population abreast of events. It was almost inevitable, given Manchester's remarkable pioneering spirit, that it should lead the way in a new transport revolution. A group of Manchester businessmen commissioned railway engineer George Stephenson to build a line from Manchester to Liverpool. And in September 1830, the inaugural train, the Northumbrian, driven by Stephenson himself, left Liverpool Road Station packed with dignitaries. Unfortunately, the day was marred when Liverpool MP William Huskisson, who was waiting to greet the train at the other end, got so excited at its appearance he slipped off the platform and was run over by Stephenson's rocket coming the other way. This was the world's first fully steam-powered passenger railway, and despite the death of Mr. Huskisson, soon proved a huge success. Manchester's rise from country town to heaving industrial metropolis had been nothing less than meteoric. Writers, politicians, poets and envious outside merchants all came to wonder at this phenomenon. Friedrich Engels saw things from a different perspective. His father was a German businessman with a factory in Manchester, where the young Engels worked as his father's agent. He spent his time off marvelling at and writing about another product of Manchester's incredible revolution. The town itself is peculiarly built so that a person may live in it for years and go in and out daily without coming into contact with a working people's quarter, or even with workers. That is, so long as he confines himself to his business or to pleasure walks. First of all, There is the old town of Manchester, which lies between the northern boundary of the commercial district and the Irk. Here the streets, even the better ones, are narrow and winding, as Todd Street, Long Millgate, Withy Grove and Shoot Hill. The houses dirty, old and tumble down, and construction of the side streets utterly horrible. The south bank of the Irk is here very steep and between 15 and 30 feet high. On this precipitous hillside there are planted 3 rows of houses, of which the lowest rise directly out of the river, while the front walls of the highest stand on the crest of a hill in Long Millgate. Right and left, a multitude of covered passages lead from the main street into numerous courts. In one of these courts there stands directly at the entrance, at the end of the covered passage, a privy without a door, so dirty that the inhabitants can pass into and out of the court only by passing through foul pools of stagnant urine and excrement. In 1838, the town took a step nearer completion of a major evolutionary cycle when, thanks to the efforts of Richard Cobden, Queen Victoria granted Manchester a charter of incorporation, which gave it the right to elect a town council and finally do away with the manorial court leet that was hopelessly inadequate to govern a population approaching 300,000. The new council bought the lordship of the manor from Sir Oswald Mosley for £200,000 and began to harness some of Manchester's incredible wealth for the good of the community. In 1853, the transformation in civic terms was completed when Queen Victoria granted city status, and an expansion of Manchester's boundary saw it gobble up many outlying villages, increasing the population to more than 500,000. The new city council set about improving living conditions, particularly sanitation, with clean water brought down from the mountains, opening parks, introducing gas lighting and exercising planning control to improve the quality of housing. Gradually, the plight of the people Engels had so graphically described improved, although slums would continue to dog Manchester until well into the 20th century. In 1868, Mitchell Henry, a Manchester merchant, decided to stand for Parliament. Needing a way to make his views widely known in the city, he produced an electioneering sheet, and on Saturday, October the 10th, the very first edition of his Manchester Evening News was printed. In the event, Mr. Henry lost the election and interest in his paper, which passed into the hands of Peter Allen and William Evans, both associated with The Guardian. With no political axe to grind, the Evening News was produced as an independent newspaper, the voice of the people, a reputation it's proud of to this day. In the same year Mitchell Henry printed his first election sheet, the first Trades Union Congress took place in Manchester, confirming its position at the forefront of the fight for political reform. In 1877, Manchester City Council moved to a new purpose-built home. The new town hall, topped with, what else but a golden cotton seed, was the equal of any building outside London, a grand symbol of the city's wealth and civic pride. The late Victorian period also brought about something of a cultural revolution in Manchester. Charles Halley's orchestra, founded in 1858, was acknowledged as one of the finest in the world, and the city's art galleries, libraries, schools and colleges were unrivalled anywhere outside London, both in their grand architecture and their content. The late 19th century was also significant on the sporting front. when Lancashire County Cricket Club and 2 amateur football teams were founded in Manchester. Gorton FC, who later became Manchester City, and Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Football Club. Both went on to gain league status, and Newton Heath made history when they became the first club ever to be relegated. Later, as Manchester United, they would make history of a different kind. Manchester was now one of the greatest cities in the world, in its prime and bursting with self-confidence, a confidence that brought about the single greatest engineering feat of the Victorian age. It had long been a dream of some Manchester businessmen to bring ocean-going ships into the city. In the early 1880s, crippling transport charges exacted by the railway companies and the Liverpool Dock Board caused the idea to be revived. Daniel Adamson, a Manchester manufacturer of vision and boldness, took the reins, and in June 1882 called a meeting of civic leaders and prominent businessmen. By the end of the year, a bill was before Parliament to grant the necessary powers to proceed. Meanwhile, the thought of ships sailing right into the landlocked city had captured the popular imagination, and Manchester was gripped by Ship Canal fever. Not all were in favour though. The railway companies and Liverpool fiercely opposed the scheme, and twice the bill was rejected, but Adamson was no quitter, and in 1885, after a 3-year struggle, he returned from London to a hero's welcome. The Ship Canal had been approved. On the 11th of November 1887, the first sod was cut. The Big Ditch, as it was affectionately known, was underway. A railway was built along the full 36 miles of its course, from Eastham to Manchester, for distribution of building materials and dispersal of excavated rock and soil. Mechanical diggers were soon in use along the full length of the workings, but could not entirely replace the spade and wheelbarrow, and an army of navvies were also employed. 16,000 of them, with temporary villages built to house them, together with stonemasons, carpenters, bricklayers and many other craftsmen required for such an undertaking. On New Year's Day 1894, with a touch of historical irony, the Norsemen led a procession of 71 ships from Latchford into the terminal docks at Salford. On the 21st of May, the Manchester Ship Canal was officially opened by Queen Victoria. Initially, trade on the canal was steady but unspectacular, and once the novelty had worn off, the thriving passenger trade waned in favour of the railways, although Victorian pleasure seekers, it seems, put it to other uses. As the 19th century drew to a close, plans were afoot that would see the Ship Canal come into its own and end Manchester's by now over-dependence on cotton. Trafford Park, Mr. Trafford's Park and Place, mentioned by John Leyland on his 16th century visit, was still in the family's possession, and much as Leyland had found it. But with industry now closing in, Sir Humphrey de Trafford decided to sell. On the 17th of August 1896, Trafford Park was registered as an estate company. Railways were built to link with the national system, and the site was made ready to become the first industrial estate in the world. Many large companies were attracted to Trafford Park, including the Westinghouse Corporation of America, the American Car and Foundry Company, Brook Bond Foods and Hovis, all using the Ship Canal to bring their materials in and ship their products out. Within a few years, landlocked Manchester, in terms of value of goods handled, was the 4th busiest port in the country, with the Prince Line running a regular service to all Mediterranean ports. By 1901, the population of the Manchester conurbation was 2 million, and the infrastructure was having to keep pace with the city's growth. On June the 6th, Manchester's first electrified tram route from Albert Square to Cheetham Hill opened, with the Lord Mayor at the helm of the inaugural tram. The outbreak of World War I saw a different kind of cargo passing through Salford docks, when a liner full of American troops arrived here. But it was the outward shipments that were the most significant. Greater Manchester sent hundreds of thousands of young men to fight a war that ultimately achieved virtually nothing, except the decimation of a whole generation. In 1915, one of the first groups of many marched past the town hall, watched by Lord Kitchener. Many would never see Manchester again. (1926) saw the Trades Union Congress, formed in Manchester in the 19th century, flex its muscles. Between the 3rd and the 12th of May, the general strike brought Britain to a virtual standstill. Never before had the potential economic strength of the unions in challenging the government been shown with more powerful effect. Thanks to its broad industrial base, Manchester weathered the post-war depression and the general strike better than most, and by the 1930s prosperity and confidence had returned, once again reflected in its architecture. The new Central Library, opened by King George V in 1934, was, and still is, one of the largest public libraries in the world. An extension to the town hall followed 4 years later, but hardly had its doors opened than another war with Germany loomed.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Manchester's status as one of the country's most important industrial centres made it one of the Luftwaffe's most obvious targets. Children were evacuated to safer areas, and the city began to prepare for war. For 3 days before Christmas 1940, hordes of bombers dumped their deadly payloads on the sprawling city, and by Christmas Eve, flames from warehouses in Portland Street and Mosley Street cast an eerie orange glow and a pall of smoke over festive Manchester. The inside of the Free Trade Hall was completely gutted, and within a mile radius of Albert Square, the devastation was immense. 165 warehouses, 150 offices, and countless poor inner-city homes were either destroyed or badly damaged. The Ship Canal was a regular target but stayed open throughout, Salford docks carrying out repairs to ships damaged in the Atlantic. Trafford Park, too, received a great deal of unwanted attention, but its 75,000 workers continued to produce tanks, planes and munitions that helped defeat Germany. The end of war was greeted with jubilation and a huge sigh of relief, all of course tinged with sadness for those who hadn't survived to celebrate. After the war, the development resumed, with the slum clearance that had been helped along by Adolf Hitler continuing. The planners finally did away with city centre housing, creating out-of-town housing estates, like the futuristic garden suburb of Wythenshawe, to take former slum dwellers to the fresh air of Cheshire. The city was left to shops, offices and businesses, old and new. 150's newcomer to Manchester went on to become one of its most successful and best known firms, one of its greatest feats, giving Coronation Street to the world. The 1950s also saw trade on the Ship Canal reach a peak. and Manchester United's Busby Babes wowing the world of football. But both were heading for decline, one in tragic circumstances. On the 6th of February 1958, the team's plane landed at Munich to refuel after a European game against Red Star Belgrade. Snow was falling and the runway was icy. The plane overshot the runway and crashed, killing 8 of the Busby Babes and 15 others, including members of the coaching staff and journalists travelling with the team. 10 years later, Old Trafford was basking in glory instead of despair, when a rebuilt Busby team brought the European Cup back with them from Wembley. The decline in the Ship Canal's fortunes was less dramatic, but in many respects more final. As ships got larger, the canal and Salford docks simply couldn't handle them, and gradually trade tailed off and they became derelict. This was mirrored elsewhere in the city, as slowly its world markets dwindled, and the Manchester meteor ground to a halt. Even the Manchester Guardian jumped ship and decamped to London. Some new life came in the 1970s with the opening of Piccadilly Radio, the first of a national network of commercial radio stations, which coincided with the appearance of a new wave of rock and pop bands that would see Manchester emerge as the modern music capital of the world. The opening of the Arndale Centre also did its bit to stop the backward slide, but it was the creation of the Royal Exchange Theatre in the old Cotton Exchange that, in many ways, showed the way forward. Old buildings could successfully be put to new uses, and gradually the city began to reinvent itself. The old docks area was imaginatively redeveloped as a business and leisure complex. The derelict Central Station became a modern conference and exhibition centre, and news that Manchester would host the 2002 Commonwealth Games sparked up a frenzy of new projects like the Manchester Evening News Arena and a projected new swimming complex. Then in 1996, city planners were unexpectedly presented with a new development problem when, in June, the IRA unleashed a £3,000 bomb which blew up the core of the city centre. By now, though, Manchester's movers and shakers had become adept at raising money from every available source, and, with a bubbly blend of private, public and European cash, soon had new plans for the bombed area. The dust had hardly settled when work started on a new complex that will include the largest Marks and Spencers in the world. One of the many buildings damaged in the blast was the old Wellington Inn. What was left of it was salvaged, moved and painstakingly reconstructed on a new site near the cathedral. Elsewhere, old mills have taken on new identities, and the Bridgewater Canal provides a pleasant waterside location for the Halle Orchestra's new state-of-the-art home. So, as the city approaches a new millennium with refreshed vitality, history, after a fashion, has repeated itself. In May 1999, Vikings were once more instrumental in bringing frenzied activity to the streets of Manchester, this time in happier circumstances.
Solskjaer has won the European Cup for Manchester United. It's absolutely astonishing.